All right, before we get started, just a couple of announcements. Firewood Ministry will be continued next week, beginning at 8 o'clock, breakfast at 8, and then work after. So we'll be cutting and delivering wood on the 30th. Bring your chainsaw, axe, mauls, wood splitters, and pickup trucks too. We'll deliver 1 truckload of wood to those we have helped in the past and any other new folks. So you can contact Brenda here at the church if there's anybody else that you know would like some. Shoe boxes are located in the front of the sanctuary in the fellowship hall. And the next Sunday, the 31st, will be the potluck. It's also the last Sunday of Pastor Appreciation Month. So I believe Ralph's heading that up. Is that correct? Oh, Brenda's heading up. All right. What are we do now that he's not here this Sunday? We can talk freely about him. Karen, you can tell him. No, I expect you to tell us stories about him, but what are we doing for Russ? Okay. Is Karen included in that? All right, okay. Those of you that don't know, he just bought himself a boat this summer. Actually, he bought Karen a boat, correct? All right. Does he have a captain's hat? Does anybody have a captain's hat that they could give up? Because I was thinking that'd be perfect for him. I call him the skipper as it is anyway. So. I mentioned the Operation Christmas Child. So they need to be turned in by November 19th, which is fast approaching. So if you're planning on writing a check for shipping charges, just write the check out to Cornerstone, and then that will be given to Samaritan's Purse to get all that taken care of. It's not going to be cashed till after November 20th. So if any questions on that, see Brenda.
If you write a check to Samaritan's Purse, it won't be cashed after that. You send it to us,
Okay. All right. Anything else for announcements? What did we have for numbers yesterday, Ken, for the wood ministry? 5 people? Okay. All right. Nothing else. All right. Title of my sermon today is Friends. Feel free, too, to sit. If you want to add something or say something in the middle of the sermon, feel free. I like audience participation instead of listening to me talk the entire time. All right, so what is a friend? Anybody want to offer an explanation or a definition? First of all, can everybody hear me? Yeah. All right, okay.
Somebody you can rely upon.
Somebody you can rely upon. So I found a definition that says a person who has a strong liking for and trust in another person. And this is kind of an important one, a person who is not an enemy. So some other names for friends: your alter ego, an amigo, buddy, acquaintance, associate, colleague, companion, hobnobber. I guess I'm not really familiar with that term, but. And then on we go for different names for friends. The Bible mentions friends 53 times and friendly 49 times. So we've talked about what the definition is. What are some important qualities maybe you would find as a friend? Trustworthy, honest, somebody that will support you. I think one that I like a lot is one that will tell you if you're wrong and not be afraid to hurt your feelings if they feel you're wrong. I think that's important to have as a friend. Remember what I said about audience participation? I don't know if we really want that anymore. Yes, that applies to your mother. All right, so I'd like to spend some time today looking at a few characters in the Bible that we would like to have as friends and some we probably would not. Anybody have a guess as to who would be a good friend that would be listed in the Bible? And obviously we're going to talk about Jesus, but that's not who we're thinking of right now. Did I tell you that's who we're going to talk about? Speaking of friends, this is one of my good friends, Ken. So yes, Jonathan is the right answer. Thank you. So Jonathan, we're going to look in 1 Samuel. And I'll kind of give you a summary of Samuel 1:18, and then we're going to read Samuel 19 and 20. So in verses 1 through 4, we see one of Jonathan's strengths, unselfish love. In verses 6 through 9, we see Saul displaying jealousy towards David. For a little background, Jonathan and David were very good friends, and Saul is Jonathan's father, who is the king of Israel. We'll get into a little more of that as we go. So David is returning from killing Goliath, and the women of the cities of Israel were singing and dancing to meet Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. The woman sang as they played and said, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Saul became very angry, for this displeased him, and he said to have ascribed David 10,000s and to me thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul looked at David with suspicion from that day on. In verses 10 through 19, Saul attempts to assassinate as an evil spirit came mightily upon Saul. Saul admits he was afraid of David. He sought to have David removed from his presence. So Saul appointed him as a commander of thousands, and he went out and came in before the people. David was prospering in all his ways. The Lord was with him. So the key thing there was, the Lord was with him. So even when you have an enemy that seeks to harm you, however that may be, the Lord is with you. He's going to protect you. So David was loved by Israel and Judah. He went out and came in before them. Saul then tries to give his oldest daughter Merab to David to wed. Saul said, only a valiant man for me, be a valiant man for me and fight the Lord's battles. Saul pledges not to put his hands against David. He instead lets the hand of the Philistine be against him. So basically what he did is he set him up to go to battle to be killed. And then David questions whether or not he should be the king's son-in-law. It's kind of a bait and switch here, but Merab is then given to Adriel the Metholite instead of David. So Saul promised David a wife and then gave her to someone else. Later in chapter 18, Saul's daughter Michal was given to David in marriage. Saul hoped this would be a snare to David. He hoped that the hand of the Philistine would be against David. In order to marry Michal, Saul requested David bring him 100 dead Philistines. Saul again planned on David being killed by the Philistines. David instead brought back 200 Philistines. Saul then gave Michal to David and was even more afraid of David. And this is the key part. He knew the Lord was with David. Just a little bit of background on why Saul hates David. So on chapters 19 and 20, which we're going to read, you'll see the relationship that Jonathan really put himself out for David. So starting in verse 1, chapter 19, Saul told his son Jonathan and all the attendants to kill David, but Jonathan had taken a great liking to David and warned him, my father Saul is looking for a chance to kill you. Be on your guard tomorrow morning. Go into hiding and stay there. I will go out and stand with my father in the field where you are. I'll speak to him about you and tell you what I find out. Jonathan spoke well of David to Saul, his father, and said to him, let the king do wrong to his servant David. He has not wronged you, and what he has done has benefited you greatly. He took his life in his hands when he killed the Philistine. The Lord won a great battle for all of Israel. You saw it. Would you do wrong to an innocent man like David by killing him for no reason? Saul listened to Jonathan and took his oath. As surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. So Jonathan called David and told him the whole conversation. He brought him to Saul, and David was with Saul as before. Once more, though, war broke out. David went out and fought the Philistines. He struck them with such force that they fled him. But an evil spirit from the Lord came on Saul as he was sitting in his house with a spear in his hand. While David was playing the lyre, Saul tried to pin him to the wall with a spear. But David eluded him as Saul drove the spear into the wall. That night, David made good his escape. I don't blame him. Saul sent men to David's house to watch it and kill him in the morning. But his wife warned him, if you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed. So she let David down through a window, and he fled and escaped. Then she took an idol and laid it on the bed, covering it with a garment and putting some goat's hair at the head. When Saul sent men to capture David, his wife said, he is ill. Then Saul sent the men back to see David and told them, bring him up to me in his bed so that I may kill him. But when the men entered, there was the idol in the bed, and at the head was some goat's hair. Saul said to Michal, "Why did you deceive me like this and send my enemy away so that he escaped?" She told him, "He said to me, 'Let me get away. Why should I kill you?'" When David had fled and made his escape, he went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Samuel had done to him. Then he and Samuel went to Naioth and stayed there. Word came to Saul, "David is in Naioth at Ramah." So he sent men to capture him. But when they saw a group of prophets prophesying with Samuel, standing there as their leader, the Spirit of God came on Saul's men, and they prophesied. Saul was told about it, and he sent more men, and they prophesied too. Saul sent men a third time, and they also prophesied. Finally, he himself left for Ramah and went to the great cistern at Seku. And he asked, "Where are Samuel and David?" "Over in Naioth at Ramah," they said. So Saul went to Naioth at Ramah, but the Spirit of God came even on him and walked along, prophesying until he came to Naioth. He stripped off his garments, and he too prophesied in Samuel's presence. He lay naked all that day and all that night. And this is why people say, "Is Saul among the prophets?" So as you can see here, Jonathan tried to intervene, play the intermediary to find out why his father wanted to kill David. His father could have had him put to death just for that. And then later on, when he marries, you see that his wife also deceived Saul so David could escape. All right, so now in verse 20, we get a little more to David and Jonathan. Chapter 20. 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 1. David fled from Naioth at Ramah and went to Jonathan and asked, "What have I done? What is my crime? How have I wronged your father that he is trying to kill me?" "Never," Jonathan replied. "You're not going to die. Look, my father doesn't do anything great or small without letting me know. Why would he hide this from me? It isn't so." But David took an oath and said, "Your father knows very well that I have found favor in your eyes." And he has said to himself, "Jonathan must know this, or he will be grieved. Yet surely as the Lord lives, and as you live, there is only a step between me and death." Jonathan said to David, "Whatever you want me to do, I will do for you." So now this is a conversation coming up with David and Jonathan in verse 5, and they're talking about the new moon feast. David says he's supposed to dine with the king, but instead let me go hide in the field until the evening of the day after tomorrow. If your father misses me at all, tell him David earnestly asked my permission to hurry to Bethlehem, his hometown, because an annual sacrifice is being made there for his whole family. If he said, 'Very well,' then your servant is safe. But if he loses his temper, you can be sure he is determined to harm me. As for you, show kindness to your servant. You have brought him into a covenant with you before the Lord. If I am guilty, then kill me yourself. Why hand me over to your father?" "Never," Jonathan said. "If I had the least inkling that my father was determined to harm you, wouldn't I tell you?" David asked, "Who will tell me if your father answers you harshly?" "Come," Jonathan said, "let's go into the field." So they went there together. Then Jonathan said to David, "I swear by the Lord of Israel that I will surely sound out my father by this time tomorrow. If he is favorably disposed toward you, I will not send you word and let you know. Will I not send you word and let you know? But if my father intends to harm you, may the Lord deal with Jonathan, be it ever so severely, if I do not let you know and send you away in peace. May the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. But show me unfailing kindness like the Lord's kindness as long as I live, so that I may not be killed. And do not ever cut off your kindness from my family, not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth." So Jonathan made a covenant with the house of David, saying, "May the Lord call David's enemies to account." And Jonathan had reaffirmed his oath out of love for him, because he loved him as he loved himself. So I'm going to skip ahead here and kind of get to the part where Jonathan was going to shoot arrows to let David know. Verse 35, in the morning, Jonathan went out to the field for his meeting with David. He had a small boy with him, and he said to the boy, "Run and find the arrows I shoot." As the boy ran, he shot an arrow beyond him. When the boy came to the place where Jonathan's arrow had fallen, Jonathan called out after him, "Isn't that arrow beyond you?" Then he shouted, "Hurry, go quickly, and don't stop." The boy picked up the arrow and returned to the master. The boy knew nothing about all this, only Jonathan and David knew. Then Jonathan gave his weapon to the boy and said, "Go, carry them back to town." After the boy had gone, David got up from the south side of the stone and bowed down before Jonathan 3 times with his face to the ground. Then they kissed each other and wept together, but David wept the most. Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for we have sworn friendship with each other in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord is witness between you and me, and between your descendants and my descendants forever.'" Then David left, and Jonathan went back to town. Sorry, that was a little drawn out, but basically the point of that is, if you look at all that Jonathan gave up for David, it's quite a sacrifice. That truly, to me, sounds like a true friend. So a little background on Jonathan. His name means Jehovah's gift. So Jonathan was a prince, the son of the first king of Israel, Saul, like we mentioned. As such, he was a leader in Israel and part of the royal line. He was of the family of Benjamin, a tribe noted for heroes and warriors. And like we just talked about, he ended up in the conflict between Saul and David. So he's 30 years old when first introduced in the book of 1 Samuel. He lived in Israel about 1000 BC. Towards the beginning of his life, it was a difficult time. Israel was subject to the Philistines and other foreign powers. He was crowned the first prince. Saul was crowned the first king over Israel. Under his rule, Israel became a local power in the region. It was the beginning of the golden years for Israel. As a prince, Jonathan likely had a higher education than most of the people. He was skilled in war and lived at the royal court. He had a great relationship. He had great leadership abilities, and all people looked up to him. So Jonathan was the first prince of Israel. He was in line to become the second king. Yet because of Saul's unfaithfulness, this never happened, and instead Jonathan is remembered as a loyal friend to David and a devoted leader to his country. He was a strong warrior, skilled with a bow, and leader of the people. So as you can see, he was going to be the next king. But instead of that, he chose to protect that which God appointed to be the next king. So he displays unselfish love, as we see in the first part of chapter 18. He also displays courage. Earlier in the book of Samuel, it talks about he didn't let numbers deter him in battle. Probably his greatest strength was his submission to the will of God. In 1 Samuel 20, 31 and 42, and then again in 23:17, Jonathan humbly submits himself to the will of God, even when it meant giving up his future kingdom. He didn't pursue his own interest or push for his own way. When he realized that God wanted to establish David and not himself, he humbly bowed out of the picture and submitted to God's hand. I don't know if I would have done the same, to be honest with you. And I don't know how many of us would. I think that that really shows his true submission to the will of God. His next strength was he was loyal. Obviously, as we just talked about, he saved David's life on more than one occasion and was a loyal friend. But he also was a loyal son and didn't reject his own father. So, like I talked about, a good friend might tell you when you're doing wrong. I think Jonathan tried to display that to Saul as well. So they remained undivided even in death. 2 Samuel verse 123. Jonathan even said that Saul did nothing without discussing it with him. So important acts in his life and events. He smote the garrison of the Philistines, starting the war to free Israel from their power. 1 Samuel 13:3. And he attacked the Philistines with only his armor bearer and started a route that drove the Philistines before them. How he died by the hands of the Philistines in war, and he died fighting for his country. So what lessons can we learn from Jonathan? He knew how to be a true friend. Jonathan loved David as himself. He was willing to give everything that belonged to him to David. He encouraged David in the Lord. He protected David. This wasn't a friendship with a purpose of gaining something, as so many friendships are in the world. In the world, people say, "I will be your friend if you do these things for me." But Jonathan was selfless, and this is how we should relate to our friends. All right. Who can think of another person that they would want as a friend? I'll give you hints in the New Testament. And it's not Jesus yet, but we'll get to him in a minute. How about Barnabas? Anybody know anything about Barnabas? I think the thing that I like the most about Barnabas is he's known as a great encourager. I would think that'd be a pretty good trait to have as a friend. All right, so he's also known as Joseph, a Levite. If you want to jump over to Acts 4, we're going to be in Acts for the rest of this, and I'll tell you where we're going to be. It says Acts 11, and we're going to get there, but start in chapter 4 first, beginning in verse 36. Now Joseph, a Levite, of Cyprian birth, who was also called Barnabas by the apostles, which translated means son of encouragement, and who owned a tract of land, sold it and brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet. His original name was Joseph. So where and when he lived. Little is known about where he lived. He was living in Jerusalem in Acts 11 when the issue of Greek disciples who were preaching the gospel arose. He was in Antioch in Acts 11, verse 22. From there he went to Tarsus, later on in Acts 11, to seek Paul to assist him while following up and discipling the young converts at Antioch. So training. This is interesting. While researching this, I wasn't aware of this. Apparently he was trained by Jesus. Likely he was one of the 70 who the Lord sent out in Acts 11 and Acts 14. But no mention is made of his occupation, though he had enough means to own a field. So his place in history. He and Paul were largely responsible for establishing the church at the Jerusalem Council and the liberty of believers in Christ. They overcame the intense pressure from the Jews for Gentile believers to be required to obey the law as well as to follow all the rituals of Judaism. So special traits. He had the gift of encouragement, and there's several verses in Acts that talk about that, and he also was an apostle. What about weaknesses? Maybe he allowed his emotions to affect his judgment about taking along John Mark. So what this is talking about was there was an issue between John Mark and Paul. I believe John Mark quit on a journey that they were taking to preach, and then Barnabas convinced Paul to bring him along the second time. Surprisingly, he was also influenced by the hypocrisy of Peter and others not associated with Gentile believers. This is particularly surprising in light of the fact that Barnabas previously was the one who embraced and strongly encouraged Greek believers who were preaching the gospel in Antioch. So some of his strength: he was generous, he gave a field, he was courageous. In Acts 9, 26 and 27, if we want to skip over to that. When he came to Jerusalem, he was trying to associate with the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing that he was a disciple. But Barnabas took hold of him and brought him to the apostles and described to them how he had seen the Lord on the road and that he had talked with him, and how at Damascus he had spoken out boldly in the name of Jesus. And he was with them, moving about freely in Jerusalem, speaking out boldly in the name of the Lord. So this section of verses is talking about when others were afraid of Saul, thinking that he was trying to deceive them to bring them harm. Barnabas courageously took Saul under his wing and vouched for him. He took the risk to be a friend when Saul really needed one. I'm sure most of you know the story. On the road to Damascus, Saul sees a great light. He then changes his name to Paul, and prior to that, he crucified Christians. That was his job. He's also very supportive of Paul, like we just mentioned. He was persuasive. He told those disciples that, told the apostles that he would vouch for Saul, that Saul was a changed man. He was very sound doctrinally. In Acts 11, 20 through 22, if you want to turn there. We'll actually start in verse 19. So then those who were scattered because of the persecution that occurred in connection with Stephen made their way to Phoenicia and Cyprus and Antioch, speaking the word to no one except to the Jews alone. But there were some of them, men of Cyprus and Cyrene, who came to Antioch and began speaking to the Greeks, also preaching the Lord Jesus. And the hand of the Lord was with them, and a large number who believed turned to the Lord. The news about them reached the ears of the church at Jerusalem, and they sent Barnabas off to Antioch. Then when he arrived and witnessed the grace of God, he rejoiced and began to encourage them with all resolute heart to remain true to the Lord. For he was a good man and full of the Holy Spirit and of faith. And considerable numbers were brought to the Lord. And he left for Tarsus to look for Saul. And when he found him, he brought him to Antioch. And for an entire year they met with the church and taught considerable numbers. And the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. So Barnabas was part of that. He also was responsible. He was good, godly, discerning, humble. He was a great encourager, which is what his name translated to, diligent and trustworthy. All very good attributes in looking for a friend. So let's skip ahead now to probably somebody you would not want to have as, some characters you would not want to have as friends. I think of the three so-called friends of Job. That's probably not anybody you would want to have as a friend. Can anybody list the names of those guys? All right, I couldn't either, so I had to look them up. Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar. Those are Job's friends. Just a brief little bit on each of them. Bildad, the Shuhite, in speaking with Job, his intentions were consolation, but he became an accuser, asking Job what he had done to deserve God's wrath. The three speeches of Bildad are contained in Job 8, 18, and 25. We're not going to go there. In substance, they were largely an echo of what had been maintained by Eliphaz the Temanite, the first of Job's friends to speak, but charged with somewhat increased vehemence because he deemed Job's words so impious and wrathful. Bildad was the first to attribute Job's calamity to actual wickedness. So basically he accused Job of being wicked, albeit indirectly by accusing his children who were destroyed of sin to warrant their punishment. His brief third speech, just 5 verses in length, marked the silencing of his friends. So the second friend, Eliphaz, is called the Temanite. And the arguments that pass between Job and his friends, it's this man who opens each of the 3 series of discussions. And then it lists Job's replies. He may have been the eldest of the friends because he appears mild and modest. In his first reply to Job's complaints, he argues that those who are truly good are never entirely forsaken by providence, but that punishment may be justly inflicted for secret sins. He denies that any man is innocent and censures Job for asserting freedom from guilt. Eliphaz exhorts Job to confess any concealed iniquities to alleviate his punishment. His arguments are well supported, but God declares at the end of the book that Eliphaz made a serious error in speaking. Job offers a sacrifice to God for Eliphaz's error. His primary belief was the righteous do not perish, the wicked alone suffer, and in measure as they have sinned. I don't know if you'd really want to call these guys friends. In his time of need, instead of supporting Job, they pretty much blamed him for everything that had happened. If you remember the beginning of the book of Job, God and Satan are talking about if Job's a righteous man. So none of what happened to Job was caused by his own doing. So the third friend, Zophar, he also was there to comfort him during his illness. His comments can be found in Job 11 and Job 20. He suggests Job's suffering could be divine punishment and goes into great detail about the consequences of living a life of sin. Unlike the first 2 friends, he only speaks twice to Job. He is the most impetuous and dogmatic of the 3. He's the first to accuse Job directly of wickedness, averring indeed that his punishment is too good for him. He rebukes Job's presumption in trying to find out the unsearchable secrets of God, and yet, like Job's other friends, he promises peace and restoration on condition of penitence and putting away iniquity. His second speech is a lecture on the fate of the wicked, ending with a summary appraisal in the style of his first friend. So I'm just going to go on a limb here. I don't think I'd want these friends. But the greatest friend that we can have is Jesus Christ. He gave his life so that we can have eternal life. He paid the ultimate sacrifice. Remember this, he will never leave you nor forsake you. I'm sure most of you know the 23rd Psalm, a Psalm of David, but when you feel like there's no one in the world who understands, read the chapter. It only has 6 verses. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leadeth me in the path of righteousness for his name's sake. Yet though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of my enemies, and thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So I invite you now to think of who you call friends. A couple of friends that I have would probably be unhappy that I'm going to mention them, but they'll get over it. In fact, one just stepped out. You know, I think of sacrifices that we talked about today, and one person in this church that sacrifices a lot without ever complaining is Fred. And if you ask him to do something, he jumps right at it and does it. If you need help with something, if he can help you, he will. That's the definition of a true friend, a friend. And the other friend I want to mention is going to sing for you now, and that will be Ken. So if you're ready, Ken, come on up. And she's not sure it has batteries, so you might want to. She's not sure the batteries are working, so you may want to leave this one.
Well, I don't even know how to use this one.
Put it in behind your ear, and you can hold on to it, or try that one.
I'll try that one up here. And we didn't, there we go. We got it. Brian, thank you.